A janitor thinks he can fix this? CEO Isabella Drake's voice sliced through the air like glass, echoing in the grand hall. Hundreds of executives turned their eyes toward David Carter, the man in a faded uniform clutching a mop bucket. She laughed, snapping her manicured fingers. "Fix this jet engine, David, the one MIT and Stanford couldn't touch. Do it here now in front of all of us. And when you fail, and you will, you're gone." The room erupted in laughter. Executives smirked. Interns covered their mouths. The sound rolled like thunder until it drowned out the silence around him. In that instant, David wasn't a man. He was a punchline, and you, watching, feel it too. The sting of being dismissed, the fury of injustice, the ache of watching someone mocked not for their skill, but for who they are. But stay. Because what begins in humiliation will end in defiance. What starts as a joke will rise into history, stay until the end. And you'll see how the man they laughed at became the one who saved the skies. If you believe justice needs a voice, stay until the end and subscribe to Black Voices Justice. The auditorium lights burned too bright, casting sharp shadows across the polished steel walls of Aeronova Systems. Rows of executives, investors, and engineers sat rigid in their seats, their faces expectant but strained. At the center of it all stood Isabella Drake, the 42-year-old CEO, her posture a sculpture of authority. Her tailored suit shimmered under the spotlights, and her words dripped with contempt. "A janitor thinks he can fix a jet engine?" The insult cracked through the room like a whip. Conversations died instantly. Heads turned, eyes narrowing toward the back row, where a man in a faded maintenance uniform stood frozen. David Carter. For 3 years, he had swept these floors, replaced light bulbs, and emptied trash bins in the hangars of Aeronova. His official badge read technical support, but everyone knew he was nothing more than the man with the mop. He had learned to live with invisibility, but not tonight. He had raised his hand when Isabella announced cost cuts, his voice trembling but steady enough to carry across the hall. "Ma'am, I think the issue with the engine isn't in the software integration. It's in the harmonic resonance." The words hung in the air, daring to exist where they shouldn't. The audience reacted in waves, muffled laughter, confused stares, whispered comments. Some executives smirked, others frowned, wondering if they had misheard. Isabella's painted lips curled into a smile that was sharper than any blade. She took a step forward, her heels striking the floor with surgical precision. "This," she said, gesturing toward David with a theatrical sweep of her hand, "is who thinks he understands what 12 teams of MIT and Caltech engineers failed to solve." Her tone made the air itself heavy. "Tell me, Mr. Carter, do you plan to scrub the turbine with your mop until it behaves?" The crowd erupted with restrained laughter. Even some engineers, exhausted from weeks of failure, allowed themselves a cruel chuckle. David lowered his hand slowly, his jaw tight. The humiliation pierced deeper than usual. But behind the sting, a voice older than his own whispered in memory, "Engines don't lie, son. They tell you what they need if you listen closely." That was his grandfather, Samuel Carter, speaking again through time. Isabella turned her back on him, confident she had crushed a distraction. But the moment had already been planted. A seed of doubt flickered in the room. Investors shifted in their seats, curious why a man with nothing to gain would risk ridicule so openly. The hook of injustice had pierced deep, and for David, the storm had only just begun. Flashback, Detroit, decades earlier. The air inside Samuel's garage always smelled of oil, steel, and stubborn hope. Engines of all kinds, old Mustangs, gutted Chevrolets, even discarded propeller turbines from training planes lined the walls like silent veterans waiting for revival. 12-year-old David stood on tiptoe, watching through the haze of heat as Samuel leaned over a rusted engine block. The old man's hands were dark, weathered, but precise, like a surgeon who treated machines instead of people. "Come closer, boy," Samuel said without looking up. "Time to learn how to listen." David placed his hand on the vibrating metal under his grandfather's guidance. "Feel that?" Samuel asked. The engine thudded rhythmically, but there was a faint stutter every few seconds like a skipped heartbeat. "It's talking to you," Samuel continued. "Engines got voices. Some whisper, some scream, but they never lie. You respect them, you listen, and they'll tell you what's wrong." That summer, while other kids played baseball, David learned to interpret those voices. A high-pitched whine meant bearings were worn. A burnt smell pointed to oil degradation. Vibrations out of rhythm revealed hidden fractures. More than mechanical knowledge, Samuel passed on survival wisdom. He had been one of the first black foremen at a major aerospace plant, tested twice as hard and believed half as smart by default. "People will dismiss you before they know you," he told David. "But an engine doesn't care about your skin, your schooling, or your bank account. It only cares if you hear it right." Those words became scripture for David. Years later, when his mother's illness forced him to abandon a transfer to a 4-year university, he clung to that philosophy. Community college gave him a degree in mechanical systems, but bills gave him a broom. Aero Nova had promised consultant opportunities. What he got was a uniform, a cart, and silent hallways that ignored him. Still, he listened. Every night after the executives went home, he lingered by the great jet prototype, the crown jewel of Aero Nova's future. A fully autonomous aircraft powered by a revolutionary AI-guided jet engine. But the engine had one fatal flaw. After precisely 14 minutes and 37 seconds, it shook violently, overheated, and shut down. No patch, no redesign, no diagnostic could tame it until now. David had heard something in its voice, a strain, a dissonance, like an orchestra forced to play in 2 different keys. Metric parts made in Germany, imperial calibrations coded in California, 2 worlds colliding inside the turbine, and he knew it. But standing in that auditorium, mocked by the CEO and dismissed by experts, he wondered if anyone else would ever let him prove it. The lights still glared. The silence still stung. And above it all, Isabella's smirk told him what the room already believed. He was nobody. What none of them realized was that this nobody carried a legacy strong enough to make steel sing. The applause of cruelty lingered long after the words faded. David sank into the back row, the weight of every stare pressing against him. The humiliation clung like smoke. His pulse hammered in his ears. For a moment he wished he had stayed silent, that he had not raised his hand at all. But silence had cost him too much already. He thought of his mother's hospital room, dim light, beeping monitors, the smell of antiseptic and wilted flowers. The medical bills stacked higher than his paychecks. Every shift at Aero Nova wasn't just about survival. It was about keeping her alive. He couldn't let her sacrifices be meaningless. He couldn't let Samuel's wisdom dissolve into dust. Still, the question haunted him. What if they're right? What if he was just a janitor? Hours later, when the auditorium emptied and the executives vanished into black cars, David returned to his nightly duties. The grand jet prototype sat alone in Hangar 4, its silver body gleaming under cold, fluorescent light. The AI-guided engine was silent now, but David approached as if it were breathing. He rested a palm against the turbine housing. The metal still held traces of the day's heat, as though the machine remembered its own frustration. And in the hum of silence, he heard it again, the subtle cry, the dissonant vibration echoing from memory. 14 minutes. 37 seconds, he whispered. Why exactly then? He crouched near the intake fan, studying the alignment marks, the welds, the way the blades caught light. He wasn't supposed to be here. Cameras watched every corner, but by now the guards ignored him. He was invisible, useful cover for a man trying to listen. He closed his eyes. Samuel's voice returned. Engines don't care about resumes, boy. They care about rhythm, and David heard the rhythm, 2 frequencies colliding. German precision built to the micrometer, forced to obey American coding, written in fractions of inches. It was like a choir split between two keys, fighting itself until the harmony shattered. He pulled a worn notebook from his pocket, filled with sketches and calculations he'd made during weeks of cleaning duty. Diagrams of turbines, conversion tables between metric and imperial, notes on resonance dampeners he'd studied in late-night online courses. Page after page testified to the mind behind the mop. But who would ever read them? The next morning, whispers followed him through the corridors. Engineers avoided eye contact. A few smirked, repeating Isabella's taunt under their breath. "Going to scrub the turbine clean, Carter?" He ignored them, but the sting landed anyway. Their expensive suits, their six-figure salaries, their degrees framed in mahogany. They carried authority he didn't. His framed community college diploma still hung in a one-room apartment, next to a photo of his mother smiling weakly in a hospital gown. That night, he returned again to Hangar 4. He wasn't alone. Dr. Elena Morales, the aerospace veteran brought in as an outside consultant, stood beside the jet with her leather notebook. Her silver hair caught the light, her eyes sharp with decades of technical judgment. She glanced at David, then at his notebook in his hands. "You were the one who spoke up," she said softly. David hesitated, unsure if it was accusation or recognition. "Yes, ma'am. You said harmonic resonance?" She tapped her pen against the turbine casing. "Why?" His throat tightened. This was his chance, or a trap. He drew a slow breath. "Because the engine isn't failing randomly. It fails at the same interval, like clockwork. That's not software confusion. That's physics. Two systems fighting each other." Elena studied him carefully, her silence more intimidating than Isabella's insults. Finally, she nodded. "Go on." He opened his notebook, flipping to a page filled with wave diagrams. The parts were manufactured in Munich, metric tolerances, but the AI calibration is coded here, in imperial units. The system keeps correcting problems that don't exist. It's chasing ghosts. At exactly 14 minutes, 37 seconds, the resonance builds to critical failure. Her eyes narrowed, then softened with something like curiosity. "And your solution?" David hesitated. He had sketched it 100 times, a harmonic stabilizer, a simple disc to buffer the frequency mismatch. To him it was obvious. To others it would sound absurd. Before he could answer, footsteps echoed through the hangar. Isabella's voice sliced the air. Well, the janitor and the consultant. Plotting miracles in the dark?" David stiffened. Elena closed her notebook calmly, but her glance toward him carried a message. Not yet. Isabella's heels clattered against the concrete as she circled the engine. "Enjoy your theories, Carter. Tomorrow we demonstrate for our investors. And when this jet fails again, I'll know exactly whose name to cut first." Her smile lingered like poison before she vanished into the shadows. David stood frozen, notebook clutched tight, hope colliding with dread. Elena touched his arm briefly. "Don't stop listening," she said quietly. Sometimes the smallest voices solve the biggest problems. And just like that, she was gone too, leaving David alone with the silent machine. He pressed his hand against the turbine one last time, feeling the faint hum of possibility. The world thought he was nothing, but the engine knew better. Morning sunlight poured through the glass atrium of Aeronova Systems, but no warmth reached the people inside. Anxiety radiated like static. Engineers shuffled into the main conference hall with sagging shoulders, their eyes bruised from sleepless nights. Executives whispered in hushed tones, balancing the language of confidence with the reality of despair. The centerpiece of the room was not a presentation, nor a chart, but absence. The jet prototype, the future of autonomous aviation, remained grounded. Its AI-guided engine had not completed a single uninterrupted test in weeks. Billions hung in the balance, and worse, the clock was nearly out of time. At the head of the table, Isabella Drake tapped her manicured nails against the polished oak, each sound sharp enough to cut. "Gentlemen and ladies," she said, "our investors arrive in 2 days. If this engine fails again, Aeronova collapses. No more excuses. Her gaze slashed through the room. 70 million in contracts already slipping. 100 million in pending deals. And 12 teams of geniuses. Her eyes narrowed at the engineers. All useless. Silence answered her. The engineers avoided her eyes, staring instead at their laptops filled with error codes. Then her stare drifted further, finding David Carter where he stood by the doorway, clutching a tray of water pitchers. "You especially," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "Deadweight. A charity hire. The only reason you're still here is because we need the floors clean for our investors. Don't forget that." A ripple of cruel laughter spread across the table. David's hands trembled, but he set the tray down gently, as if the calmness of his gesture could protect him from the storm. Inside, however, the humiliation seared. The meeting adjourned in chaos. Executives spilling into the halls like desperate actors exiting a doomed play. Isabella's voice followed them. 2 days! If we fail, jobs are gone. Do you hear me? Gone! David lingered in the empty hall, staring at the abandoned whiteboards covered with equations. His mind buzzed with patterns, conversions, resonance charts he had memorized during late-night cleaning. What if I'm wrong? He thought. What if I speak again and they tear me apart? But another thought pushed back. What if I'm right, and silence costs everyone? He walked toward Hangar 4 once more, his sanctuary. The jet loomed like a sleeping giant. Its silver fuselage reflected the fluorescent glow, but to David, it looked alive, as though it were waiting for someone to hear its pain. He pressed his palm against the turbine, feeling vibrations others ignored. Each thrum carried a message, each pause a warning, and he knew the truth. This engine didn't need more credentials. It needed someone to listen. The following afternoon, the investors arrived. Black cars lined the entrance. Men and women in tailored suits emerged, their accents thick with German consonants and French vowels. They represented billions, and their patience was razor-thin. At their center walked Klaus Richter, CEO of Eurojet Industries, a man whose reputation for precision rivaled the engines he oversaw. Every glance he gave seemed to measure, every handshake to weigh. Beside him was Dr. Elena Morales, her calm authority balancing the storm. She had been asked to provide technical oversight, but she carried herself like a judge summoned for a trial. David watched from the back of the hall as Isabella welcomed them with rehearsed charm. She spoke of innovation, disruption, the future of aviation, yet beneath her veneer tension crackled. Every executive in the room knew the truth. If the engine failed now, the partnership dissolved, and Aeronova's empire crumbled. The demonstration was scheduled for the next morning. That night, David couldn't sleep. He sat on the floor of his apartment, textbooks and notebooks scattered around him. His mother's framed photo sat on the table, her tired smile reminding him why he fought. He whispered to the empty room, "They'll never let me near that engine. Not unless I force the issue." And he remembered Isabella's smirk, the cruel challenge disguised as dismissal. A janitor thinks he can fix a jet engine? Maybe that was his opening. He pulled his grandfather's old calipers from a toolbox, their edges worn but faithful. "Engines don't lie," Samuel's voice echoed in his memory. "They just wait for someone willing to hear the truth." David closed his notebook with resolve. Tomorrow, he would speak again, even if it cost him everything. The morning came swift and merciless. Employees flooded the atrium, whispers trailing like smoke. "The investors are here." The final test. If it fails, we're done. The jet waited in Hangar 4, surrounded by cameras, diagnostic machines, and the nervous silence of hundreds. The German delegation sat like a tribunal. Executives hovered like defendants. Engineers prayed for miracles. And in the back, David Carter stood once more, invisible yet burning with a decision. Would he stay silent, or would he risk humiliation again, for the chance to save them all? The hall was packed. 500 employees lined the auditorium seats, their faces tense, their whispers heavy with dread. Camera crews from the company's media team adjusted lights and microphones. preparing to broadcast the engine test to investors across the globe. At the center of it all sat the prototype jet engine mounted on a reinforced platform. Its steel casing gleamed under the spotlights, hiding the turmoil within. Monitors surrounded it, filled with endless error codes that had mocked Aeronova's brightest minds for weeks. Isabella Drake stood at the podium, every inch the confident CEO, despite the cracks beginning to show in her voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we are about to prove to the world that Aeronova remains at the forefront of autonomous aviation. Her words sounded like iron, but David Carter could see the tension in her hands as she gripped the microphone. He stood at the very back, leaning against the wall, invisible as always. Yet when Isabella announced cost reductions and non-essential terminations, her eyes flicked directly to him. The air thickened. This was more than a test for the company. It was a hunt for someone to blame. David's heart pounded. He remembered his grandfather's garage, the way Samuel had pressed his hand against a humming engine and said, "Every machine has a heartbeat. You just have to learn how to hear it." He closed his eyes, hearing the jet engine's memory in his mind. 14 minutes, 37 seconds. Not a glitch. Not bad code. A song sung out of tune, torn between metric and imperial, harmony against dissonance. His hand lifted almost on its own. "Ma'am." His voice cut through the hum of murmurs. 500 heads turned. The investors in the front row shifted, surprised. Dr. Elena Morales raised an eyebrow, her sharp gaze suddenly alive. David swallowed hard. The problem isn't in the AI integration. It's in the harmonic resonance. The turbine is fighting itself because it was built in metric but calibrated in imperial. That's why it fails at the same interval every time. A silence heavier than steel filled the hall. Then came the laughter. Nervous at first, then cruel, rippling through the engineers who had failed for weeks. Isabella seized it, smiling like a predator who smelled blood. "Well, well," she purred. "Our janitor speaks of harmonics. Tell me, Mr. Carter, will you fix it with your mop? Or perhaps with a bucket of soap?" The crowd chuckled again. Some looked away, ashamed, but most watched with fascination. This was corporate theater, but one person didn't laugh. Dr. Morales uncapped her fountain pen and began to jot notes. Her voice rang clear across the hall. "I'd like to hear more." Her words froze the room. Investors turned to her. Engineers straightened in disbelief. Isabella's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "More?" she echoed. "Yes," Morales said firmly. "He's identified a mechanical software resonance mismatch. That is not a janitor's language. That is engineering language. Let him demonstrate." Isabella recovered her composure, tilting her head with exaggerated amusement. "Very well, if our maintenance man believes he can do what 12 teams of experts could not, then let us make this interesting." She gestured grandly toward the engine. "You have 2 hours, Mr. Carter, in front of everyone. Fix it, or you're done here. Not just fired, blacklisted. I will personally ensure every aerospace firm knows your name as the man who embarrassed himself before the world." Gasps echoed. Security guards moved toward the doors, their presence a silent threat. But Isabella wasn't finished. She turned to the media team. "Stream this live. Let the world watch what happens when the unqualified attempt the impossible." Hashtags bloomed instantly. Jet test, such impossible fix. So justice in the skies. Within minutes, thousands tuned in online, expecting disaster. David's breath caught in his chest. The trap was set. His career, his future, his very dignity balanced on a knife's edge. But then, a voice steadied him. "Engines don't care about resumes, boy. They care about rhythm." Samuel's words returned, wrapping around his heart like armor. David straightened. His hands no longer trembled. "Then give me the 2 hours," he said clearly, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. Dr. Morales rose from her seat, authority radiating from her every movement. "I will serve as technical witness. If this man succeeds, his expertise will be recognized. If he fails, the record will show fairness." Klaus Richter, the German investor, adjusted his glasses, and gave a single nod. Agreed. Let us see American problem-solving. The hall erupted in murmurs. Phones lit up. Tweets flew. Employees pressed forward, eager to witness humiliation or miracle. And David Carter walked toward the engine, his maintenance uniform stark against the sea of expensive suits. He placed both hands on the cold steel, closing his eyes as though greeting an old friend. The audience whispered, but David heard only the heartbeat of the machine. The test had begun. The engine loomed like a beast of chrome and fire, surrounded by cables, monitors, and skeptical eyes. Every whisper in the hall, every camera lens fixed on David Carter carried one expectation: failure. He stood in his maintenance uniform, a stark contrast to the polished suits around him. Yet his hands rested on the turbine casing with reverence, as though he were touching something sacred. Dr. Elena Morales watched closely, pen poised above her notebook. Klaus Richter folded his arms, his cold eyes narrowing with measured interest. Isabella Drake leaned against the podium, her smirk promising ruin. David drew a deep breath and spoke, his voice steady. This engine isn't broken. It's misunderstood. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. He ignored it. He bent close to the turbine, listening. For 30 seconds, the hall fell into uneasy silence. Some shook their heads, convinced the janitor was playing at theatrics. But Morales noticed the change in his expression. Concentration, then recognition, as if he were conversing with the machine itself. "It's fighting itself," David said finally, loud enough for all to hear. "The German-built components are precise to 1,000th of a millimeter. But the American software interprets in fractions of an inch. That's why it overheats after 14 minutes and 37 seconds. The AI keeps correcting problems that don't exist. On the screens, oscilloscopes traced jagged waves, patterns the engineers had stared at for weeks without understanding." David pointed to them. "See those spikes? That's resonance building to critical failure. The system isn't wrong, it's singing in the wrong key." Gasps rippled through the hall. Marcus Hale, lead engineer from MIT, stepped forward, his face pale. "That's impossible. We tested harmonics extensively," David met his gaze calmly. "You tested the harmonics the AI expected, not the harmonics the parts actually produce." Morales leaned closer to the screen, her eyes sharp. She scribbled something in her notebook, then spoke. "Explain your fix." David reached for a nearby cabinet of spare parts. From it, he lifted a small metal disc no larger than his palm. Its perforations caught the light. He held it up for all to see. "A harmonic stabilizer," he said simply. "Instead of reprogramming or rebuilding, this balances the resonance. A bridge between metric precision and imperial calibration." Isabella barked a laugh, her voice echoing like broken glass. "You mean to tell me a $50 piece of scrap can solve a problem that's cost us millions?" David didn't flinch. Sometimes the simplest answer is the right one. The crowd erupted into murmurs. Online comments flooded the live stream, many mocking, some curious, a few intrigued. Engineers whispered calculations to each other, trying to catch up with the janitor's logic. David stepped toward the turbine, tools in hand. His movements were steady, practiced, like a man who had rebuilt engines in cramped garages and under flickering lights for most of his life. Each bolt he loosened, each connection he adjusted, carried the confidence of inherited wisdom. Morales leaned closer to Richter and whispered, "Watch his hands. He's done this before." Richter's eyes narrowed further, but he said nothing. For 12 minutes, David worked. The audience grew restless. Some recorded with phones, others muttered wagers under their breath. But gradually, curiosity began to replace ridicule. The precision of his adjustments, the clarity of his explanations, this was no act of desperation. This was knowledge applied with elegance. Finally, he stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. The stabilizer gleamed in place, small yet resolute, a whisper of defiance against millions of dollars in wasted effort. "Ready for testing?" he said. The hall fell into breathless silence. Morales took her place at the diagnostic station, her fingers steady on the controls. Engineers leaned in, disbelief battling with hope. Isabella crossed her arms, her smile tighter now, though her eyes betrayed unease. Richter checked his watch. "Start it," he commanded. The ignition key turned. With a roar that shook the hall, the jet engine awakened. Flames licked within the chamber. The turbine spun faster, until the air itself vibrated with power. At first, it was the same as every failed attempt. The hum, the growl, the deceptive stability. People exchanged knowing looks, convinced they would see smoke soon. But then, something was different. The knocking was gone. The vibration smoothed into harmony, like an orchestra finding its rhythm. On the screens, jagged waves straightened into clean, elegant lines. Diagnostic lights shifted from red to green, one by one, until the board glowed like a constellation of approval. Morales's eyes widened. Temperature stable. Pressure optimal. Harmonic frequency locked at 12,000 RPM. No deviation. The audience leaned forward, hearts racing. They knew what came next. 14 minutes and 37 seconds. The cursed threshold. Every second ticked louder than the engine itself. 11 minutes, 12, 13. David closed his eyes, hand resting gently on the turbine, as if he could feel its heartbeat. The crowd held theirs. 13 minutes. The room was silent except for the whir of the turbine. Engineers stared at the screens, their bodies tense as bowstrings. Executives leaned forward, gripping the edges of their seats. Even the investors, who had perfected the art of stoicism, showed flickers of anticipation. 14 minutes. The cursed mark approached like the toll of doom. In every prior test, this was the moment when the engine shook, temperatures spiked, and the system collapsed in failure. Many braced themselves, expecting fire suppression foam to rain down once more, but the seconds passed. 14 minutes, 30 seconds, 35, 37. The diagnostic screens remained calm, temperature steady, pressure perfect, harmonics balanced. The engine kept purring. Gasps filled the auditorium. A few engineers clapped hands over their mouths, eyes wide with disbelief. Online, the live stream exploded with comments. "It's still running? How? The janitor's beating MIT." Morales' pen scratched furiously across her notebook. Her voice, steady but edged with awe, filled the hall. Efficiency at 97%. That's above theoretical maximum. "I've never seen readings this clean." The murmurs swelled into shouts. Some applauded, others shouted in disbelief, but no one looked away. For the first time in 6 weeks, the impossible seemed possible. David opened his eyes slowly, hand still resting on the turbine. He felt the difference not just in sound, but in vibration, in rhythm. The machine wasn't fighting itself anymore. It had found its song, and yet his jaw tightened. Something still wasn't right. 20 minutes passed, 30. The engine showed no sign of faltering. Employees near the glass walls cheered, some crying with relief. Executives began calculating contracts in whispers. Investors exchanged glances of growing respect, but David frowned. He had learned never to trust applause too quickly. Engines told the truth in whispers, and this one was whispering something faint, something easy to miss, a resonance deep within, subtle. Like a string stretched too tight, he leaned closer, listening. Morales noticed. "What is it?" she asked quietly. David hesitated. To speak now would invite doubt again, but to stay silent would betray everything Samuel had taught him. "There's still a weakness," he said finally. "The stabilizer fixed the mismatch. But if pushed beyond prototype conditions, extended altitude tests, extreme stress, this engine will crack." "The dampener buys time, not perfection," gasps again, this time tinged with fear. Isabella seized the moment. "Of course," she shouted, her voice slicing through the tension. "Even the janitor admits his fix won't hold. This is nothing but a delay, a circus trick." The hall wavered. Hope collided with cynicism. Executives shifted uncomfortably, caught between miracle and mockery, but Morales stood tall. He's not wrong. Even perfect solutions require refinement. But what he achieved in 2 hours surpasses everything your engineers accomplished in 6 weeks. Her words cut Isabella's triumph short. Yet the damage was done. The mood shifted again. Doubt re-entered the air. Klaus Richter raised a hand, commanding silence. We've seen a stabilization no one else could achieve. But Mr. Carter is correct. Reliability must be proven under real flight conditions. He gestured to the window. Outside, on the runway, Aeronova's prototype jet waited like a predator ready to pounce. We will test it now! The hall erupted into chaos. Engineers protested. Executives panicked. Isabella's face blanched for the first time. You can't, she snapped. If the engine fails mid-flight? Richter silenced her with a glare. If it fails, we walk away. If it succeeds, Aeronova is reborn. Are you afraid of the truth, Ms. Drake? Her lips pressed into a thin line. Morales turned to David. Will it fly? His throat tightened. Every rational instinct screamed to say no, to beg for more time. But Samuel's words echoed, engines don't lie. They tell you if you listen. David placed his hand back on the turbine, feeling its steady rhythm. It wasn't perfect, but it was ready to try. Yes, he said. It will fly. The audience flooded toward the runway, phones out, live stream climbing past 50,000 viewers. Mechanics hurried to install the stabilized engine into the jet's frame. The silver fuselage gleamed under the morning sun, wings stretching like the arms of destiny. Inside the cabin, no pilot sat waiting. This was an autonomous jet, guided by AI. The only question was whether the engine would sustain it long enough to prove Aeronova's dream real. David stood beside Morales as the final bolts tightened. His palms were damp, but his eyes locked on the horizon. The crowd gathered along the glass walls, breathless. The investors lined up like judges. Isabella stood apart, her expression unreadable, but her fists clenched at her sides. Engines roared to life. The runway trembled. The jet taxied forward, faster, faster, and then it lifted. Wings slicing the sky, wheels retracting, the aircraft climbed into the blue. The hall erupted into cheers. But David's chest remained tight, because this was only the beginning. The jet climbed higher, its silver wings slicing against the vast expanse of morning sky. Inside the hall, hundreds of employees and executives pressed against the glass walls, their reflections shimmering with awe. For the first time in months, Aeronova's dream seemed airborne, literally. On the screens, telemetry data scrolled rapidly. Altitude, temperature, fuel pressure, harmonic balance. All numbers glowed green. Cheers broke out. Engineers hugged each other, relief spilling from faces that had known only exhaustion and ridicule. But David Carter did not cheer. He stood rigid at the front of the crowd. Morales by his side, eyes fixed on the readings. He heard something no one else did, the faint hum of struggle beneath the engine's steady roar. It wasn't failing yet, but like a violin string stretched too tight, it carried the threat of snapping. Morales sensed his unease. You still hear it, don't you? David nodded slowly. The dampener works for balance, but long-term strain will push it past its limits. She studied him, her sharp mind weighing fear against trust. Engines always confess to the ones who listen, she murmured, almost to herself. At minute 10, the jet circled smoothly over the bay. Employees erupted again, the live stream comments scrolling too fast to read. Words like miracle and justice filled the screen. Hashtags trended worldwide. Isabella Drake forced a smile, but her eyes burned with fury. Every second the jet stayed airborne was another crack in her authority. Yet she clung to a hope. Failure could still arrive. At minute 15, the cursed threshold had long passed. The jet showed no signs of strain. Klaus Richter leaned forward, his cold demeanor softened by the glint of possibility. Impressive, he muttered in German. His associates nodded, already calculating investment expansions. Then it happened. At minute 17, a spike. Tiny at first, just a blip on the harmonic graph. Most missed it, too caught up in celebration. But David saw it. His stomach clenched. "There," he whispered. Morales followed his gaze. The spike appeared again, sharper. Pressure fluctuated. A warning light flickered amber, then steadied. The cheers faltered into uneasy murmurs. Isabella's lips curled into a predator's smile. On the live stream, comments turned frantic. "Something's wrong." The graph spiked. "Don't crash, please!" Richter's jaw tightened. "Explain." David's voice was low, urgent. "The dampener is holding, but the stress compounds with altitude. The higher it climbs, the more the resonance strains against its design. If it keeps ascending, another spike. This one sharper, sustained for 3 seconds before stabilizing." Morales grabbed the microphone. "Command control, level altitude now! Hold position!" Technicians scrambled at consoles, sending instructions to the autonomous system. The jet steadied at 20,000 feet, its engines straining but intact. The hall held its breath. Every screen became a lifeline, every green number a prayer. David's fists clenched. His fix had given them flight, but not safety. The beast was airborne, yet fragile. Minutes stretched like hours. At 25 minutes, the engine still held. But the spikes returned, subtle and insistent, like whispers of a storm yet to break. Richter turned to David. "Can you guarantee survival?" David met his gaze, unflinching. "No, not without refinement. But I can promise you this. No one else will get you closer. And if we bring her down now, we live to perfect her tomorrow." Silence followed, heavy with truth. Richter exhaled slowly. Then he gave the order. "Initiate descent." Technicians moved quickly. On screen, the jet banked gracefully, turning back toward the runway. Applause rose again, tentative but hopeful. Yet even as relief spread, David felt the weight of unfinished battles. The world would celebrate the miracle. But he knew the fight was only beginning. As the jet descended through the clouds, Morales placed a hand on his shoulder. "Today you bought Aeronova a second chance. But tomorrow they'll demand perfection. Are you ready for that?" David looked out at the shrinking silver dot in the sky. His grandfather's voice echoed, "Engines don't lie. They tell you if you listen. I don't have a choice," he whispered. The jet touched down, wheels kissing the runway with delicate precision. The crowd erupted in thunderous applause. Screens lit up with green confirmation, successful flight. But in David's heart, the real test had only just begun. The runway shook as the prototype rolled to a stop. For a moment, silence held the hall like a spell. Then, as the jet's engines powered down, the applause returned, louder than before, an avalanche of sound. Employees wept openly. Some dropped to their knees in relief. Aeronova had flown. Yet David Carter stood still, his gaze fixed on the telemetry screens. The harmonic spikes still lingered in his mind, faint echoes of danger. He knew what the crowd didn't. Survival today did not guarantee survival tomorrow. Morales saw it, too. She leaned close, her voice low. "They'll call this victory. But you and I know it's only borrowed time." David nodded. "Engines don't lie. They whisper their warnings." Klaus Richter rose slowly from his seat, his presence commanding silence. His associates gathered around him, murmuring in German, their clipped tones filled with calculation. Finally, he turned to the crowd. "Today we witnessed proof of resilience, proof of genius born not in ivory towers, but in quiet labor." He gestured toward David. "This man accomplished in hours what others could not in weeks." The applause swelled again. But then Richter's voice hardened. "Yet brilliance without reliability is only half a gift. Investors do not gamble on miracles. They require guarantees. Aeronova is not saved yet." The cheers died quickly. Unease returned, settling over the hall like fog. Isabella Drake seized the opening, stepping forward with venom in her smile. "You heard him. One successful flight under limited conditions does not erase 6 weeks of failure. Nor does it change the fact that our so-called consultant fixed nothing permanently. He admits it himself." Murmurs rippled. Faces that had glowed with hope now twisted with doubt. David felt the shift, the way admiration could curdle into suspicion. Morales bristled. Without his stabilizer, we would still be staring at a dead machine. Temporary patches don't make an engineer, Isabella fired back. They make a liability. And when millions and lives are at stake, liabilities are dangerous. The hall divided. Some nodded grimly at Isabella's words. Others glared at her, unwilling to see David dismissed after his triumph. The live-stream audience erupted with arguments, hashtag shifting from the engineering miracle to corporate sabotage. Richter raised a hand, silencing the storm. Enough. His gaze cut to David. Do you believe you can deliver not only innovation but reliability? David's throat tightened. He could lie, promise perfection, win temporary applause. But Samuel's voice echoed, engines don't care for promises. They only respond to truth. I can't guarantee perfection today, David said, steady and unflinching. But I can promise that if you give me the tools, the time, and the authority, I will deliver what no one else can. Not a patch, not a miracle. A system that lasts. Gasps rippled through the hall. It was not the safe answer. But it was the honest one. Richter studied him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled, a thin, precise expression. Honesty under pressure. Rare in this business. Isabella's eyes widened, panic flashing. You can't possibly be considering... But Richter silenced her with a look sharp enough to wound. Morales stepped forward. The board should understand. What you witnessed today was not luck. It was inherited wisdom meeting overlooked skill. Engines don't just need theory. They need listeners. And David Carter listens better than any engineer I've seen. The words hung heavy, undeniable. Employees began nodding. Some clapped again, quietly at first, then louder. The tide shifted, hesitant but growing. Yet Isabella was not finished. She pulled a tablet from her bag and tapped furiously. If you want proof of liability, check the internal files. He was hired as maintenance, not an engineer. He lacks credentials, lacks clearance, lacks... Her words cut off as the screens behind her lit up, displaying the very files she tried to weaponize. Emails mocking David, memos labeling him the janitor, internal jokes signed with her name. The livestream audience devoured the revelations instantly. Gasps filled the hall. Morales' eyes narrowed. You did this? Isabella froze. But it was too late. The damage was irreversible. David stood silent, the storm raging around him. He had lifted a jet into the sky. He had exposed the truth in sound and steel. Yet the fight was far from over. Morales whispered, They'll come for you harder now. Success makes enemies louder than failure. David's jaw set. He looked past the glass walls to the runway where the jet stood cooling in the sun. Then let them come. Engines don't lie, and neither will I. The crowd buzzed, uncertain but alive with tension. What had begun as triumph was now war, a war between arrogance and truth, between power and justice, and David Carter had just become the battleground. The morning after the test flight, Aeronova's headquarters buzzed like a disturbed hive. News outlets replayed the live stream endlessly, headlines screaming about the janitor who saved a jet. Investors called non-stop, analysts speculated, and employees walked taller in the corridors, proud that their company had made history. But pride was fragile. Inside the boardroom, storm clouds gathered. David Carter sat at the far end of the long glass table, still wearing the plain maintenance uniform that had made him invisible for 3 years. Across from him sat Isabella Drake, her immaculate suit and icy glare sharpened into weapons. Beside her, lawyers shuffled papers with the precision of surgeons preparing for battle. Klaus Richter presided at the head, expression unreadable. His associates whispered in German, every syllable clipped with calculation. Dr. Morales, seated to David's right, tapped her pen against her notebook, the sound a steady metronome of defiance. Yesterday's spectacle, Isabella began, her tone sweetened with poison, was impressive. No one denies that. But miracles do not equal sustainability. Investors cannot build empires on fairy tales. Mr. Carter's patchwork fix has not proven scalability, nor has he proven himself qualified to lead a program of this magnitude. She slid a folder across the table. Inside, you will find documentation of his employment. Maintenance hire. No engineering license. No graduate degree. Barely an associate's diploma. And yet we are supposed to trust him with billion-dollar aircraft? Her words sliced through the air. Some executives nodded uneasily, afraid of the liability she described. David said nothing. He had learned that silence could be stronger than defense, especially when truth was already whispering in every corner of the room. Morales leaned forward. Credentials don't listen to engines, people do. And the only person who heard what our PhDs couldn't was sitting right here, Isabella smirked. Ah, the romantic defense. Talent over training. Instinct over science. It makes for a compelling headline, but it won't sustain investor trust. Klaus raised a hand, silencing them both. His eyes settled on David. What do you need to deliver reliability? The room stilled. David straightened, his voice calm but firm. A team willing to work outside the manual. Access to full engineering facilities, not just mop closets. Time, not 6 years, not 6 months, but 6 weeks. And freedom from those who value appearances over results. His eyes flicked briefly toward Isabella. The words hit like thunder. Executives shifted in their seats. Lawyers exchanged glances. Isabella's smile faltered. And if you fail? David didn't flinch. Then you'll have lost no more than you already have. But if I succeed, Aeronova won't just have an engine, it'll have the future of autonomous flight. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then Richter spoke. 6 weeks, he said, his voice measured. We will give him the chance. Gasps rippled around the table. Isabella's face drained of color, then flushed crimson. She slammed her palm on the table. You can't be serious. Entrusting the future of this company to a janitor? Richter's gaze cut through her fury. To the only man who proved your engineers wrong? Yes, the decision was final. Outside the boardroom, the atmosphere shifted again. Whispers chased David through the halls, some supportive, others scornful. Employees watched him with new eyes, the janitor who had become their last hope. Some bowed their heads in respect. Others turned away, clinging to prejudice. In the cafeteria, mechanics cheered him. In the executive lounge, managers muttered about risks. In the engineering bay, interns whispered like disciples about harmonic resonance, trying to mimic his language. But when the applause faded and the stares turned to shadows, David sat alone in his small apartment. His framed community college diploma hung crooked on the wall. Beside unpaid medical bills and stacks of technical manuals worn with use, the cheers of yesterday could not silence the truth. If he failed, he would not just lose his job. He would confirm every insult, every dismissal, every cruel email that branded him nothing more than a janitor. Samuel's voice echoed in his memory. Engines don't lie. But people will. Prove them wrong anyway. David closed his eyes, exhaustion pulling at his bones. Tomorrow the real battle began. The next morning, the engineering bay felt different. Normally a fortress of calculation and rigid protocols, it now buzzed with curiosity. Engineers glanced up from their stations as David Carter walked in, escorted by Dr. Morales. Some greeted him with hesitant nods. Others whispered behind their hands, skepticism sharp in their eyes. The prototype jet engine sat in the center of the bay, its chrome casing gleaming under bright lights. It looked less like a machine and more like a judge waiting to deliver its verdict. David set down his worn leather notebook, the same one he had carried since community college. Its pages were filled with sketches, calculations, and phrases his grandfather had once spoken in a Detroit garage. This was not theory from Ivy League lectures. This was survival intuition and inherited craft. Morales addressed the room. We have 6 weeks. Mr. Carter leads diagnostics. You will treat his direction as official. The announcement hit the engineers like a shockwave. Marcus Hale, the MIT-trained team leader, stepped forward. His dark circles betrayed 6 sleepless weeks, but his pride remained intact. With respect, Dr. Morales, he said, his voice tight. "We've dedicated our lives to aerospace engineering, and now we're expected to follow orders from a janitor?" A murmur of agreement spread. Some avoided David's eyes. Others glared outright. David opened his notebook calmly. "You don't have to like me, but yesterday the engine flew. It wasn't perfect, but it flew, and that means something all of you missed." He turned the notebook toward them. Drawings of harmonic waves filled the page, overlaid with his annotations. "This isn't about degrees. It's about resonance. The engine doesn't care where you studied. It cares if you listen," the words hung in the air. Some scoffed. But a few, especially the younger engineers, leaned closer, curiosity outweighing prejudice. The work began. David assigned tasks not by seniority, but by instinct, pairing engineers who had never collaborated, asking them to test angles and frequencies instead of running the same software patches. He encouraged them to listen to the engine during idle runs, to close their eyes and feel the vibrations instead of staring only at screens. At first, resistance was fierce. One senior engineer muttered that they were wasting time with garage tricks. Another rolled his eyes. When David asked for recalibration of torque settings using both metric and imperial units. But then small breakthroughs appeared. A junior technician noticed a subtle pattern in vibration changes. Another spotted inconsistencies in thermal readings when measurements were cross-checked in dual systems. Each discovery echoed David's warnings, proving that intuition and science were not enemies but partners. Morales observed closely, her pen racing across her notebook. Every shift in the team's energy told her that a revolution was underway. Not just mechanical, but cultural. Yet Isabella Drake was not idle. From her office, she watched the live stream replays obsessively, searching for angles to discredit David. She called allies on the board, feeding them doubts about liability and security. "If this experiment fails," she hissed into the phone, "Richter's reputation collapses too. Do you want to be tied to that?" Her campaign was ruthless. Internal memos questioned David's authority. Rumors spread about him falsifying his diploma, about him being a charity hire. Every whisper was designed to erode the fragile trust he was building. David heard the rumors. They stung, but they did not stop him. At night, in his cramped apartment, he spread technical manuals across the floor, recalculating harmonic equations, sketching stabilizer variations. Bills piled beside him, reminders of a life still on the edge. But Samuel's voice steadied him. "Engines don't lie. Keep listening." 3 weeks in, the team reached a turning point. During a midnight test, the engine ran smoother than ever. No spikes, no strain, harmonics aligned for 29 minutes straight. When the run ended, silence filled the bay. Then applause. Genuine, unforced, filled with respect. Marcus Hale approached David afterward, his pride bent, not broken. "I don't know how you heard it, but you were right. And I was wrong," David smiled faintly. "Engines don't care about being right or wrong. They just want to be understood." The tide was shifting. Slowly, painfully, but shifting. The 4th week arrived with heavy clouds over Aero Nova's campus. Inside the engineering bay, however, the atmosphere burned electric. Screens glowed with steady data, harmonic graphs finally tracing smooth curves instead of jagged peaks. The prototype engine, once cursed with failure, now purred like a living creature at peace. David Carter stood with grease on his hands and determination in his eyes. Around him, engineers who had once scoffed now leaned in, eager for his guidance. The shift was undeniable. Respect was growing, even if grudging. But the storm outside mirrored the storm within the company. Isabella Drake's whisper campaign had spread like wildfire. Anonymous memos questioned David's legitimacy. A leaked investigation hinted at discrepancies in his hiring file. Rumors circulated that his stabilizer was stolen from German patents. The boardroom became a battleground. Richter defended David fiercely, citing results. Morales countered every attack with data and testimony. But Isabella's allies pressed harder, framing David as both savior and liability. "What happens?" they asked. If the miracle fails during a real mission? David knew the whispers. He felt their sting each time he walked the halls. Yet every night, in his small apartment, he turned the noise into fuel. He replayed telemetry logs, recalculated equations, tested variations in simulation. Sleep became a luxury. Coffee became survival. Samuel's voice carried him forward. Engines don't lie. People do. Listen to the right one. One evening, after a 16-hour shift, Morales found David hunched over blueprints, eyes bloodshot. "You're burning out," she said firmly. "I don't have time to rest," he muttered. "Every second they're waiting for me to fail." She closed his notebook gently. "Then let's make them wait forever." It was the closest she had come to admitting how much she believed in him. Week 5 brought the harshest test yet: extended endurance trials. The jet engine would run at maximum thrust for 90 minutes, simulating takeoff, cruise, and descent conditions. Failure meant not just embarrassment, it meant grounding the entire program permanently. The bay was packed. Executives, engineers, mechanics, and even cafeteria staff crowded the observation windows. Cameras streamed live to investors worldwide. Isabella stood near the back, her lips curved into a sharp smile, ready to seize on disaster. David placed his hand on the turbine, eyes closed for a brief moment. He felt its heartbeat steady, its rhythm strong. "Start it," Richter commanded. The ignition roared. Flames churned within the chamber, turbines spinning to life. The floor trembled. Monitors lit up, data flooding every screen. 10 minutes, stable, 30 minutes, still smooth. Engineers exchanged hopeful glances. At 60 minutes, murmurs turned into cheers. "It's working!" someone cried. Even Richter allowed himself a nod of satisfaction, but David frowned. His ears picked up something faint, a subtle irregularity beneath the harmony. A pulse out of sync. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He leaned toward Morales. "It's not enough." "The stress is building," she stiffened. "Can it hold?" "I don't know," he whispered. At 75 minutes, the first spike hit. Screens flashed amber warnings. Pressure surged, then dipped. Gasps filled the room. Isabella's smile widened. David sprang into action, directing the engineers. "Adjust the intake valves by 0.05. Recalibrate the resonance buffer." His voice cut through the panic like steel. Hands flew across consoles. The engine sputtered, coughed, then steadied. Green lights returned. The crowd exhaled as one, but David's face remained grim. That wasn't random. "The stabilizer is reaching its limits. We need a deeper solution, or next time, it breaks completely." The room quieted, his words chilling the brief celebration. The test ended at 90 minutes, technically successful. Applause erupted, but it rang hollow in David's ears. He knew the truth. The beast had not been tamed, only restrained. Later, as the bay emptied, Morales stayed behind. She found David staring at the engine like a soldier studying an enemy. "You saved them again," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, I bought time. But time runs out." The weight of his words hung heavy, foreshadowing the storm yet to come. The night after the endurance trial, David Carter couldn't sleep. The cheers, the applause, the handshakes, they all faded into static. What stayed was the faint, offbeat pulse he had heard beneath the roar of the jet engine. In the quiet of his apartment, he replayed the telemetry on his laptop. Numbers scrolled across the screen, steady for minutes, then spiking at 75. He slowed the feed, listened through the audio sensors, and there it was again, a faint discord. Like a violin string stretched past its tolerance. Samuel's voice whispered in memory. "Engines tell the truth to those who listen. Don't ignore the whisper." David rubbed his eyes, exhaustion blurring the screen. He knew what it meant. The stabilizer was a bridge, not a foundation. Without redesign, the next flight could shatter both machine and trust. The next morning, he entered the engineering bay to find Isabella Drake waiting, her smile sharp as glass. "Well." "Hero," she purred. "Still savoring your miracle?" David brushed past her. I don't savor problems. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. You can fool the investors, maybe even Richter, but you can't fool me. That engine's still broken. And when it fails, and it will, I'll be there to watch you fall. Her words were poison, but they carried a truth he couldn't deny. He didn't answer. He just walked to the turbine, laid his hand against its side, and listened. Dr. Morales gathered the team that afternoon. The stabilizer has given us progress, she said, her tone clipped. But Mr. Carter has identified persistent flaws. We have 2 weeks left. We need innovation, not patches. Murmurs rippled across the bay. Marcus Hale spoke up. What kind of innovation? David turned to the whiteboard, his marker squeaking as he drew harmonic waves intersecting like tangled strings. We don't need to balance the engine. We need to retune it. Right now, the AI and the mechanics are speaking different languages. The dampener translates, but translation always distorts. We need integration, not compromise. The engineers leaned closer, skepticism giving way to reluctant interest. How? Marcus asked. David wrote 2 words. Adaptive resonance. It's not about locking the engine to one frequency, he explained. It's about teaching it to adapt, to shift dynamically, like a musician adjusting mid-song. The AI can learn to listen, not just dictate. Silence followed, then disbelief. That's impossible, one engineer muttered. Impossible? Morales cut in. Or just untried. The challenge hung in the air. For the next days, the bay became a crucible. David worked side by side with the very engineers who had once dismissed him. Together, they developed algorithms to let the AI monitor resonance in real time, adjusting calibration not every minute, but every millisecond. They built sensors to detect micro-vibrations invisible to traditional diagnostics. Progress was slow, grueling. Every breakthrough brought new setbacks. A promising code crashed the system. A redesigned sensor overheated within minutes. Frustration boiled, tempers flared, but David kept them focused. Engines don't lie, he reminded them. They're not fighting us. They're teaching us. We just need to listen harder. Gradually, respect replaced resistance. Even Marcus Hale, once his harshest critic, admitted, You see things we don't. I don't know how, but I'm starting to hear it too. Yet outside the bay, Isabella escalated her war. She leaked partial data to the press, twisting it to suggest instability. She whispered to investors that David's garage science endangered billions. She even approached Richter directly, urging him to cut losses before disaster. But Richter, for reasons no one fully understood, held firm. Perhaps it was pragmatism, perhaps fascination with David's defiance. Either way, his support bought time David intended to use. At the end of week 5, the prototype engine ran under adaptive resonance control for the first time. The turbines spun. Harmonic graphs shifted, then stabilized. Spikes appeared. But instead of collapse, the AI adjusted, smoothing them in real time. The room erupted in gasps. It's learning, Marcus whispered. David's hand rested lightly on the turbine. The vibration was no longer strained. It felt alive, responsive, like a partner finding its rhythm. Morales smiled for the first time in weeks. You've given it a voice. David shook his head softly. No, I just finally let it sing, but in the shadows Isabella watched with clenched fists. Her last chance was slipping away, and she would not let it go quietly. By the 6th week, Aeronova's campus pulsed with anticipation. Rumors spread through every corridor. The janitor's engine now breathed with intelligence, adjusting itself mid-flight like a living organism. Engineers whispered about adaptive resonance with awe, as though it were sorcery rather than science. The board, however, demanded proof. Not controlled tests, not short flights over the bay. Proof that the engine could sustain a real mission. Klaus Richter scheduled a public demonstration. A fully autonomous jet carrying cargo across 3 states, live-streamed for investors, regulators, and the press. Success would cement Aeronova's future. Failure would bury it. For David Carter, the challenge was more than technical. It was personal. He knew every whisper in the company, every rumor Isabella Drake had spread. If the flight succeeded, those whispers might fade into respect. If it failed, he would be remembered not as the man who saved Aeronova, but as the janitor who doomed it. The morning of the flight, the hangar was transformed into a theater. Floodlights bathed the prototype jet in silver brilliance. Rows of executives, journalists, and engineers filled bleachers along the runway. Drones buzzed overhead, streaming every detail to millions online. David stood at the edge of the stage, his plain uniform pressed but unchanged. He refused a suit, refused pretense. He wanted the world to see him as he was, a worker who listened. Morales approached, her expression firm but her voice gentle. "Nervous?" David's eyes never left the jet. "Engines don't lie, but people do. Today we'll find out which voice the world believes." She placed a hand on his arm. "Then give them no choice." The demonstration began with ceremony. Richter delivered a speech in his crisp German cadence, praising innovation and resilience. Isabella followed, her tone laced with grudging acknowledgement but layered with caveats. "We celebrate progress," she said to the cameras. "But we must remember, this technology is untested, its risks immense." Her words seeded doubt. But David didn't flinch. When his turn came, he stepped to the microphone, voice steady. "This engine was built by the brightest minds in the world. But brilliance means nothing if it cannot be heard." For weeks it spoke. No one listened. Until I did. "Today you'll hear what I heard. Harmony, not chaos." He stepped back. Silence followed, charged with tension. Engines roared to life. The prototype trembled against the runway, turbines glowing like molten suns. Data filled the screens. RPMs, pressure, harmonic graphs. Every light flashed green. The jet accelerated, wheels lifting from the earth with graceful defiance. Cheers erupted as it climbed into the sky. 10 minutes. Stable. 30 minutes. Adjustments visible. Micro shifts in resonance as the AI recalibrated in real time. The crowd buzzed. Journalists typed furiously. Investors whispered about revolutions. At 60 minutes, the jet crossed into another state, autopilot systems guiding flawlessly. Online, the livestream trended globally. Hashtags like "Your Janitor Engineer" and "G-Resonance Flight" surged across feeds. David, standing before the screens, kept his hand against the console, feeling every shift. Morales watched him, noting the quiet intensity in his face. But not everyone celebrated. Isabella lingered at the back, her eyes dark. She had one final weapon, a corrupted firmware file she had arranged to slip into the system through a trusted technician, disguised as an update. Her gamble was ruthless. If the engine faltered now, David would be blamed. And in chaos, she could reclaim control. She checked her phone. A message blinked, update injected. Effect within minutes. Her lips curved. At 70 minutes, the first anomaly appeared. A flicker on the harmonic graph. Pressure dipped slightly, then recovered. Most dismissed it as noise, but David heard it. His chest tightened, another flicker. Louder this time, he turned to Morales. "Something's wrong." She scanned the data. "Readings are still green." "Not for long," he said. His ears had caught the whisper beneath the roar. The engine wasn't singing, it was choking, and this time he knew it wasn't mechanical. The graphs began to dance erratically, small dips turning into jagged waves. The crowd murmured, confused. To the untrained eye, the jet still glided smoothly across the sky, but David Carter felt the tremor beneath the numbers. "It's not the engine," he whispered, his eyes narrowing. "It's the code." Morales leaned closer. "You're sure?" David nodded. "The resonance is fine. The AI is stumbling. It's receiving instructions that don't belong." Before Morales could respond, warning lights flashed amber across the main screen. Altitude fluctuation, fuel pressure variance. The room erupted in shouts. Executives panicked. Investors whispered furiously. Richter's voice cut through the chaos. "What is happening?" Isabella Drake stepped forward, feigning alarm. "I warned you! The so-called miracle is failing. This is what happens when you trust an amateur. Her words spread like fire. Eyes turned to David, suspicion and fear sharpening. For a moment, the weight of doubt threatened to crush him, but he steadied his breath, recalling Samuel's voice. Engines don't lie. Listen harder. He closed his eyes, blocking out the noise. The telemetry hummed in his mind like music gone sour. Then he saw it. The irregular commands buried in the stream, subtle but corrosive. Sabotage. His eyes snapped open. This isn't the engine's fault. Someone tampered with the firmware. Gasps rippled through the room. Isabella scoffed loudly. Desperation. Blaming phantoms won't save you. But Morales studied David's face, then the code. Her sharp eyes widened. He's right. Look here, anomalous packets. This isn't natural. Screens magnified the corrupted strings of data. Executives leaned forward, horrified. Investors exchanged furious glances. Isabella paled. The jet shuddered in the sky. Warning sirens blared in the control room. If the corruption spread, the AI would lose calibration entirely. A stall at this altitude meant destruction, and the end of Aeronova. Richter barked, "Fix it." Now! David's hands flew across the console. I need manual override. A technician hesitated. That's restricted. Now! Morales snapped. With trembling fingers, the technician surrendered access. David dove into the code, bypassing corrupted strings. His notebook lay open beside him, filled with hand-drawn waveforms. He matched the sabotage against the natural rhythm of the engine, deleting foreign commands line by line. The jet dipped sharply. Screams filled the observation hall. David muttered to himself, his voice steady despite the chaos. Engines don't care about liars. They tell the truth. Find the truth. At 90 minutes, the corrupted code peaked. The jet rolled dangerously, wings slicing against turbulent air. Journalists cried out. The live stream chat exploded with panic. Then David struck. He injected a patch, crude but precise, an algorithm teaching the AI to ignore false commands and anchor itself to real resonance. The graphs steadied. The jet leveled. The room went silent. Breaths held like fragile glass. Minutes ticked by. At 95, the engine hummed steady again. At 100, the warning lights faded back to green. The crowd erupted into cheers so loud they rattled the windows. Engineers hugged, executives wept. Online, the live stream comments flooded with celebration. He saved it! Justice in real time. Janitor engineer forever. But David didn't celebrate. His eyes locked on Isabella. Her face had drained of color, sweat glistening beneath her flawless makeup. She knew what he knew, that sabotage didn't just happen. Someone had pulled the strings. Morales' voice sliced the air. Security. Detain Ms. Drake, gasps. Executives turned. Investors whispered in outrage. Isabella stammered. You can't prove anything. But Richter raised his hand. We don't need proof today. We have suspicion enough. And suspicion is death in this business. Guards moved forward. Isabella's protests echoed, shrill and desperate, as she was escorted out of the hall. The jet descended gracefully, wheels kissing the runway with perfect precision. The crowd thundered with applause, but this time it carried something deeper than relief. It carried vindication. David exhaled, hand pressed against the console. He had not just saved an engine. He had exposed a lie. Morales whispered beside him, her tone soft with admiration. You didn't just listen to the machine? You listened to the silence between the notes. That's what saved us. David's gaze lifted to the runway where the jet rolled to a halt, sunlight glinting across its wings. His voice was quiet, but resolute. No. What saved us was refusing to stop listening, no matter who tried to drown it out. The aftermath of the flight rippled across the world. News anchors replayed the dramatic graphs and the sudden recovery, labeling it, "The day the janitor saved the skies." Social media swarmed with clips of David Carter's calm defiance as chaos threatened to consume the mission. Hashtags like "Resonance Flight" and "Justice in the Skies" trended for days, But inside Aeronova, the celebration was tempered by unease. Isabella Drake's arrest left a vacuum in leadership and a trail of embarrassment for the board. Investors demanded answers. How had Sabotage slipped past security? How deep did the conspiracy run? And most importantly, what would Aeronova do with the man who had saved them? David wanted none of the politics. He spent his hours back in the bay, hands on the turbine, refining the adaptive resonance code. To him, the engine was more than a machine, it was a promise. And promises needed to be kept. Morales found him there one evening, grease on his arms, exhaustion shadowing his eyes. "You should be in the boardroom," she said softly. "They're rewriting policy because of you." David shook his head. "Let them. My work's here. Engines don't change because of votes. They change because someone listens," she smiled faintly. "Still the janitor even now." "Always," he replied. The board, however, could not ignore him. Richter convened an emergency session. Executives argued about liability, public image, and whether elevating a former maintenance worker to lead engineering would inspire confidence or ridicule. Richter silenced them with a single phrase. He delivered where you did not. The motion passed. David Carter was officially appointed Chief Diagnostics Engineer of Aeronova. When the announcement hit the press, shockwaves followed. Some industry leaders mocked the decision, calling it reckless. Others hailed it as revolutionary, a symbol that talent, not pedigree, should guide innovation. Applications poured in from young engineers around the world, inspired by the idea that brilliance could come from anywhere. Aeronova's recruitment tripled in weeks. Stock prices surged, but not all celebrated. Enemies grew in the shadows, competitors who feared losing ground, and insiders still loyal to Isabella's ruthless order. David knew the fight wasn't over. It had only changed battlefields. One night, walking alone across the dimly lit hangar, David paused by the silent jet. The moonlight pooled across its wings, making it look like a sleeping beast. He placed his hand against its cool metal skin. His grandfather's words echoed again. "Engines don't care about your title. They care if you listen." David closed his eyes. Beneath the silence, he imagined the faint hum of resonance, steady and true. Tomorrow, the world would demand more flights, bigger risks, bolder promises. But for this moment, in the stillness, he allowed himself to breathe. Morales's footsteps approached. "They'll push you harder than ever now," she said quietly. "I know. They'll doubt you again." "Try to break you again." "I know." She studied him for a moment, then asked, "So why keep fighting?" David opened his eyes, his gaze steady. "Because somewhere out there, a kid is sitting in a garage listening to an old engine. And the world is telling him he doesn't matter. If I stop now, I prove them right." Morales nodded slowly. "Then don't stop. Ever." The silence returned, heavy but not hopeless. And in that silence, David Carter understood. The fight was no longer just about engines. It was about justice, dignity, and the unshakable truth that even the quietest voices deserve to be heard. The following weeks tested David Carter more than any flight. Success had made him visible, but visibility meant exposure. Every move he made was scrutinized by the press, dissected by rivals, and doubted by colleagues who still clung to hierarchy. At Aeronova's headquarters, whispers filled the corridors. "Can a janitor lead us?" What if it was luck? Engines don't care about titles, but shareholders do. David heard it all, but he did not argue. He returned each day to the bay, refining resonance algorithms, training young engineers who gathered around him like apprentices. His quiet confidence unsettled critics more than any boast could have. One evening, Morales entered the bay to find 20 interns clustered around David, listening as he explained harmonic cycles with chalk on a whiteboard. His hands moved like a conductor's, sketching waveforms, drawing arcs of energy and rhythm. "When the AI chases perfection, it cannot hear," David told them. "Our job is to remind it what harmony sounds like." The intern scribbled furiously. Eyes shining, Morales leaned against the doorframe, smiling. This wasn't luck. It was leadership. But the shadows had not gone. Isabella Drake's allies still lurked within the company, waiting. An anonymous message arrived one night in David's inbox. Engines aren't the only things that can crash. Watch your back. He read it without flinching. Sabotage had already tried to silence him once. Fear would not do it now. Instead, he doubled down. With Morales' support, he launched the Open Resonance Initiative, a program requiring every employee, technician, janitor, intern, to submit observations about Aeronova's technology. No idea was too small, no voice unworthy. At first, executives scoffed. But then a mechanic's note about airflow turbulence solved a vibration issue that had plagued design teams for months. A cafeteria worker's suggestion about supply routing cut costs by 12%. Voices once ignored now saved millions. And each success pointed back to the man who believed engines and people only thrived when heard. Still, the pressure mounted. The government demanded certification trials. Competitors seeded doubt in the media, questioning whether Aeronova's breakthroughs were safe or sustainable. Critics framed David's rise as a stunt, warning it would collapse under real-world demands. David met the storm head-on. "Judge us not by who I was," he told reporters, "but by what we've built and by what still flies." The word spread. For many, they became a rallying cry, yet victory carried loneliness. Late at night, when the hangar was silent, David would sit beneath the jet's towering fuselage, the steel giant that had both cursed and saved him. He thought of his grandfather's garage, of nights spent in dim light with only the heartbeat of a worn engine for company. He whispered into the shadows, "I'm still listening." Sometimes he imagined Samuel answering back, "And I'm proud, boy. But don't forget, the higher you fly, the stronger the wind." David nodded into the silence. He understood. The final test loomed. An intercontinental flight under government supervision, a trial that would determine not only Aeronova's survival, but the future of autonomous aviation. Failure would end everything. Success would rewrite history. As the date approached, the tension pressed on every wall of Aeronova. Executives panicked, investors circled, the press sharpened their knives, and in the center of it all stood David Carter, once invisible, now unignorable. He looked to Morales, to the young engineers, to the silent jet waiting in its bay. "This isn't just a flight," he said quietly. "It's proof that the overlooked can soar." The words carried through the hangar like a vow, echoing off steel and silence alike. And everyone listening believed the dawn of the intercontinental trial painted Aeronova's runway in pale gold. Frost clung to the grass, and breath steamed in the cold air as thousands gathered along the perimeter fences. Reporters from across the globe jostled for camera angles. Military observers stood stiff in their uniforms. Even rival corporations sent delegates, hungry to witness either triumph or collapse. The prototype jet gleamed under the floodlights, its adaptive resonance turbines humming with a low, steady pulse. The sound was different now, less mechanical, more alive, as if the engine itself anticipated the test. David Carter arrived without fanfare, wearing the same simple uniform he always had. No badges, no titles, only the quiet certainty of a man who had learned to listen. Morales walked beside him, her face set in determination. "The flight path is clear. Washington, D.C. to London. 8 hours unassisted. If anything falters," David cut in softly, "we listen, we adapt, we survive." She nodded. "Then let's fly." The jet rolled onto the runway. Applause erupted as cameras zoomed in. The live-stream audience passed 1 million, comments flashing faster than any eye could follow. Richter's voice boomed from the podium. "Today we test not just machines, but belief. The belief that innovation belongs to all who dare to hear what others ignore." Engines ignited with a thunderous roar. The ground shook as turbines reached resonance. Green lights cascaded across the diagnostic screens. The jet accelerated. Wheels lifted. The sky swallowed it whole. At first all was smooth. Altitude climbed. Resonance held steady. Viewers cheered as the jet crossed the coastline, heading toward open ocean. But 2 hours into the flight, turbulence struck. Not weather, not crosswinds, something deeper. Harmonic patterns wavered on the screens, like a song slipping out of key. Executives muttered nervously. Military observers scribbled notes. David leaned forward, hand pressed to the console. His brow furrowed. It's straining. The AI is chasing stability instead of trusting the resonance. Morales frowned. Can we override? Not from here, David said. It has to learn mid-flight. If it doesn't, it'll collapse. Gasps filled the room as data spiked red. Fuel distribution skewed. Vibrations rattled through the fuselage. Journalists whispered of catastrophe, and online, fear spread. It's failing. This is the end! David closed his eyes. Around him, the room dissolved into panic, but he shut it all out. He listened as he always had. Not to numbers, not to charts, but to the rhythm buried beneath chaos. He whispered, barely audible. Engines don't lie. Then a flicker, an irregular but familiar pulse. The same flaw his grandfather had taught him to recognize decades ago. When an engine sought perfection, it lost balance. David's eyes snapped open. It doesn't need to be perfect. It needs to breathe. He typed a rapid sequence into the console, transmitting a new directive. Reduce correction, trust natural rhythm. A philosophy turned into code. For a heartbeat, nothing changed. The jet trembled against the sky. Alarms blared. People shouted. Then the resonance locked. Graphs stabilized. Fuel flow smoothed. Vibrations faded. The jet leveled, cutting across the Atlantic with steady grace. The hall erupted in cheers, louder than thunder. Strangers embraced. Engineers wept openly. Richter himself slammed his fist on the table in triumph. Morales turned to David, tears glistening in her eyes. You saved it again, David shook his head. No, it saved itself. I just reminded it how. Cameras caught the moment, broadcasting his words to millions. And across the world, viewers felt something shift. The idea that true innovation didn't come from control, but from respect, from listening, even when the world screamed for command. The jet soared onward, London drawing closer with every minute. But for David Carter, the flight meant more than geography. It was proof, written in sky and steel, that a man once dismissed as invisible could carve harmony from chaos. And the world had no choice but to see him. London's skyline glimmered on the horizon as the jet descended through the clouds. 8 hours of steady flight, no major failures, no collapse of resonance. The impossible had become routine before the eyes of millions. On the runway at Heathrow, crowds gathered behind barricades, engineers, journalists, curious travelers who had heard of the miracle janitor who turned machines into symphonies. As the jet's wheels kissed the tarmac with a smoothness that drew spontaneous applause, the cameras zoomed in, catching every detail of triumph. The control room at Aeronova erupted in cheers. Executives leapt from their seats, investors clasped hands in victory, engineers cried openly. Richter, usually so measured, allowed himself a rare smile. History, he murmured, has been rewritten. But David Carter stood silent, his eyes fixed on the jet as it taxied to a halt. Morales touched his shoulder. You should smile. You've earned it. He exhaled slowly. It's not about me. It's about everyone who was told they didn't matter. The celebration was immediate and global. Headlines across continents proclaimed, Janitor Engineer redefines aviation. News anchors described him as a symbol of perseverance. Social feeds overflowed with messages from students, workers, and dreamers who saw themselves in his struggle. A boy in Detroit posted, My dad works 2 jobs, says no one listens to him. Today I saw someone like him save the skies. Maybe one day I can too. A young woman in Nairobi wrote, I was told not to study engineering because it's for men. Watching Carter lead this flight, I know they were wrong. David read these messages quietly, late at night when the noise faded. Each one felt heavier than the last, not as praise, but as responsibility. At Aeronova's press conference in London, the room overflowed with cameras. Reporters fought for questions, their voices rising in a clamor. How does it feel to go from janitor to engineer of the century? Do you consider yourself a symbol of meritocracy? What will you do next? David stepped to the podium, the bright lights blinding. He paused, searching for words. I don't care about titles, he said finally. I care about listening. Engines, people, ideas, they all have voices. Too often we ignore them because they don't come from the right place. I was ignored. Many of you have been ignored. But today proves something simple. The overlooked can soar if someone just gives them a chance. The room fell silent. Some journalists lowered their pens. Others swallowed hard, caught by the weight of his voice. David's final words echoed across broadcasts. This is not my victory. It belongs to everyone who has ever been underestimated. Engines don't lie, and neither does human potential if we listen. Weeks later, Aeronova launched the Carter Initiative, a global scholarship for students without privilege, designed to find hidden talent in garages, kitchens, and classrooms worldwide. Applications flooded in by the tens of thousands. Isabella Drake's trial faded into scandalous headlines. Her name became a warning of arrogance unchecked, while David's became a banner for resilience. In Detroit, the small garage where Samuel Washington once worked was restored, transformed into a community innovation hub. David stood there during the dedication ceremony, running his hand along the same cracked workbench where he had first learned to listen. This, he whispered to Morales, who stood beside him, is where the real story began. And where it must continue, she smiled. Engines never stop running. Neither should you. Back at Aeronova, David's diploma still hung on the wall of his modest apartment, faded, humble, and surrounded now by awards, patents, and photos of a jet gliding across oceans. But he never replaced his uniform, never traded the quiet dignity of work for the comfort of prestige. Because he knew the truth. Machines, like people, only thrived when someone believed they were worth listening to. And with each flight that lifted into the sky, the world heard his message anew. If you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or doubted, know this. Your voice matters. Your rhythm matters. Sometimes it only takes one person listening to change everything. And so, a man once mocked for carrying a mop carried instead the weight of a company and the future of flight. David Carter's story isn't just about engines. It's about justice. It's about listening when the world refuses. And it's about the truth that talent, no matter how hidden, can rise higher than any title. If you've ever been dismissed, if you've ever been told you were less than what you know you are. Let this story remind you, engines don't lie, and neither does your potential. Share this video with someone who's been underestimated, because sometimes one believer is all it takes. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. Your voice matters here. Your presence fuels this movement. If you believe justice needs a voice, subscribe to Black Voices Justice, turn on notifications, and join us as we tell the stories that power change. Until next time, listen closely, stand tall, and never let anyone silence your rhythm.